All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Beneficial Reuse and Tidal Marsh Restoration Project virtual public meeting. My name is Peter Valenzuela. I'll be facilitating this presentation. Tonight, we're going to present information on this project and the environmental process requirements. At this stage in the project, we are still studying various ways in which the process will be carried out. The information and project details being presented today are not fully committed to as we continue to analyze options, but we would like to share with the public the options we are considering and receive input to help guide decision making. Today's presenters are Ann Calnan and Luis Pais.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everyone. In this presentation, I am going to provide you with an overview of scoping and environmental review for the proposed beneficial reuse project. I will be followed by Luis, who is leading the design of the project. Next slide, please. In the upcoming slides, Luis and I will address the following questions. What is the purpose of scoping? Who is leading the environmental effort? What is the purpose of and need for the project? Where is the project and what does it involve? How do we transport excavated material to the ponds? How do we place excavated material into the ponds? What happens when the project is complete? What are the benefits of the project? What is the environmental clearance schedule? And how to submit scoping comments, which I know Peter already said, but we will go over this again. Following the presentation will be an open session. However, you can also include any questions or comments in the chat as we go along. Next slide, please. Scoping is the kickoff for environmental clearance for the beneficial reuse project. Scoping involves reaching out to government agencies, the public, and other interested stakeholders, such as environmental advocacy groups, to help determine what the scope of the project should be, what alternatives or options should be looked at, and what the potential environmental issues are and how to address those issues. So the design of the project at this point is very preliminary. The design and options that Luis will describe have been developed just enough to give you needed information so that you can provide meaningful feedback to the project team. Next slide, please. Both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and VTA are the lead agencies for the project. The Fish and Wildlife Service will be doing the environmental clearance in compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and VTA will be doing the environmental clearance under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. The type of environmental document we will be preparing is a combined environmental impact statement and environmental impact report, or EIS-EIR, that addresses the requirements of both federal and state environmental laws. The environmental document will include a lot of analyses on the proposed design, looking at it through the lens of various topical areas such as transportation, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, biological resources, water quality, cultural resources, and so on. One of the purposes of the EIS-EIR is to identify potential impacts at any of these or other topical areas, and to recommend measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those impacts. Next slide, please. So what is the need for and purpose of the project? The beneficial reuse project came about as one solution to deal with the large quantity of excavated material that will be generated from VTA's BART extension project. That project includes excavation to build 3 underground stations and a tunnel. The environmental document for the BART extension project stated that excavated material will be disposed of at landfills or quarries. While it is beneficial to use the material for reclamation purposes at a quarry site, it is not nearly as beneficial as using the material to raise the deeply subsided bottoms of the salt ponds to help get them to a point where tidal marsh restoration can occur. This specific activity, raising the bottoms of the salt ponds, has not been covered in any other environmental document to date. So, in order for VTA to transport material to the salt ponds for this purpose, we have to environmentally clear the work. Lastly, some of the salt ponds contain mercury from historic mining operations. Placing excavated material into the ponds will help cover this contamination. Next slide, please. As I just mentioned, the material would originate from VTA's BART extension project, which is shown here, and would include the excavated material from construction of the 5-mile-long tunnel and possibly the 3 underground stations in San Jose. Next slide, please. The majority of excavated material from the BART extension project would come from the Newhall Maintenance Facility, shown near the bottom of the graphic. The Fish and Wildlife Service and VTA identified only a few ponds in the South Bay for transport and placement of this material. These include the ponds highlighted here. All these ponds are owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service and are part of the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, with the exception of Pond A4, which is owned by Valley Water. Collectively, these are known as the project level ponds because we have identified the precise source of the excavated material, which is the BART extension project. Because we know the source of the material and the approximate amount of the material, which is up to 3.5 million cubic yards, we can conduct a very detailed project level environmental analysis with that information. Next slide, please. The environmental document will also include a programmatic level analysis of transporting to and placing material in all the ponds shown here. This programmatic level analysis will be a high-level analysis for future projects that are yet to be identified. So unlike the project level analysis, where we know exactly where the material is coming from, and we can study specific options for transporting that material and placing it into the ponds, for the programmatic level analysis, we do not have that specific information. We can make some assumptions to do the analysis, but it will be the responsibility of those future project proponents to build upon our document and to do initial environmental analysis when the details of their projects become known. Now that you know where the material is coming from for the project level ponds, the BART extension project, and we know where it is going to select ponds in the South Bay, how do we get that material there? Luis is going to explain the hauling options, which include by truck or rail or a combination of the two. And he will also explain the various construction methods that could be used to place the material into the ponds. Next slide, please.
Hey, thank you, Anne, and good evening, everyone. Like Anne mentioned, my name is Luis, and I will be discussing the hauling methods, truck routes, material placement methodologies, and infrastructure improvements for the project level ponds. Next slide. So how is the material going to be transported from the BART extension project to the salt ponds? In this visual, the BART extension project is shown by the green rectangles at the bottom right of the slide. From this location, the material is going to be hauled by truck or by rail. The truck route is shown by the orange line, which consists of using Highway 880 to State Route 237 and then to local streets. The rail route is shown by the purple line and consists of a main UPRR line going from the BART extension project to the salt ponds. From there, spur lines, which are secondary rail lines not served by the main line, will be used to take the material either to Pond 812 or towards Los Esteros Road. These options will be shown in more detail later. Next slide. This slide shows the haul routes that will be analyzed to transport the material by truck. The proposed haul routes have been selected to avoid residential areas to the extent possible. There will also be a traffic analysis performed that will help determine how we can further minimize impacts to the community. Now I'm going to provide a brief summary of the haul routes that we will analyze. If the material is coming from the BART extension project, which is basically by trucks, all trucks would use SR 237 and then use local streets to reach the project level ponds. The potential options that we're looking at from right to left are from Zanke Roads to pond A13 and A12. The next option is North First Street to ponds A12, A13, and A8. We could also utilize Gold Street Connector for ponds A8, A12, and A13, and Caribbean Drive for pond A4. Having several options will help us mitigate impacts to the community by reducing the number of trucks for each haul route. This slide also shows the potential offloading areas if the material is coming by rail. They are shown by the blue rectangles. One is next to pond A12, over to your left, upper left, and the second option is south of Los Esteros Road. Even though these rail options would reduce the number of trucks, we would still have to utilize trucks to transport material to the ponds not reached by rail. These rail options also have the benefit that some material could be transported by conveyor belt directly to some ponds, therefore further reducing the number of trucks. I will provide more detail on this option later. But at this point, I think it's worth reminding everyone that the rail option might or might not be implemented depending on the feasibility and regulatory constraints. Next slide, please. Now, like I mentioned earlier, we are evaluating two options for hauling material by rail. This slide shows the pond A12 spur option. The visual to your left shows the rail line from the BART extension project to the project ponds. The visual to your right is a close-up view of the pond A12 spur option. Under this option, a new rail spur would be constructed between the UPR mainline and the pond A12 levee. We would also have to place a temporary fill in this area, as you can imagine, to help facilitate offloading, handling, and transporting of the material. From this location, which is a big benefit because we're so close to ponds A12 and A13, the material to these ponds could be transported directly by using a conveyor belt. For ponds A8 and A4, the material will be loaded and transported by trucks. Next slide, please. Now I'll be talking about Los Esteros spur option. There is an existing spur across from pond A12 that leads to the regional wastewater facility. You can see this on the right-hand side of the slide. This spur leads to an area south of Los Esteros Road that could be used to offload the excavated material. This area is shown by the blue box on the bottom right of the slide. Next slide. This is a close-up view of the proposed offloading area. In this area, a few storage tracks would be constructed to store the rail cars and offload the material. From this location, we could transport the material to ponds A12 and A13 using a very long conveyor belt adjacent to the spur line, or we could load the material into trucks and take it to any of the project level ponds. Next slide. So this slide shows a closer view of the existing spur line. For this option, we will need to modify the existing railroad curve between the main UPR line and the spur line to meet current railroad standards. This is shown by the yellow arrow on the upper left of the slide. The bottom right shows the existing spur line crossing Grand Boulevard and Los Esteros Road prior to getting to the offloading area. Now, to maneuver the empty cars out of the offloading area and bring in the loaded cars, you need 2 tracks side by side to perform this maneuver. For this reason, there is a need to have a siding track adjacent to the spur line. The siding track cannot be built next to the offloading area due to the 2 street crossings, Grand Boulevard and Los Esteros Road, as you can see in the bottom right of the slide. Because of this constraint, the siding track must be built between the UPR main line and Grand Boulevard. You can see the siding track labeled at the center of the slide. Because of its location, there will also be a need to place additional fill to build this siding track. Next slide, please. And finally, to conclude the conversation of the rail options, there is a need for some infrastructure improvements at the bar extension Newhall Yard maintenance facility. This is the location where the tunnel excavated material will come out and be stored in a storage bin. From this location, the material will be loaded to either rail cars or trucks. We need to construct a few storage tracks, as shown by the green and red lines, to load the material from the storage bin to the rail cars. But in addition, we also need to build a few rail crossings, as shown by the blue lines, to transport the rail cars from the yard to the main UPR line. Next slide, please. Now that we're done showing the transportation methods, I will briefly be discussing the material placement methodologies. We are looking at 3 methods of placement of the excavated material within the pond. The methods include conventional equipment, hydraulic dredging, and a conveyor system. Next slide. Conventional equipment includes the use of trucks, excavators, dozers, amphibious equipment, which basically has wider tracks to work in swampy soils or subsoils, and the use of excavators and modular barges. This slide shows a visual of these types of equipment. For this method, the material will be offloaded near a pond shoreline, as you can also see in this visual, and then the material will be pushed into the pond with a bulldozer. Long-reach excavators on barges or amphibious excavators will be used to facilitate the placement of the material throughout the pond. The bottom of the slide, as you can see, shows an example of an amphibious excavator. Next slide. This method could also require the construction of temporary access facilities or temporary access roads within the pond itself to facilitate the hauling and placement of the material. The large photo shows an example of an access facility built within a lake. A turbidity curtain or something similar to it, as shown on the bottom left picture, can be used to protect an adjacent body of water or sensitive habitats from the impacts of the construction zone. Next slide, please. Another method we're evaluating is hydraulic dredging. This method would involve offloading the material into a pond, as can be seen by the yellow truck. A sheet pile bulkhead could also be constructed, also as shown, to provide a defined edge at the shoreline of the pond to facilitate the offloading of these trucks. From this location, floating, as you can see in the slide, cutter suction dredge would excavate and suction the material before pumping it through a discharge pipe into its final destination. And that is how the material would be spread to raise the pond bottoms. This method would also use a turbidity curtain or similar to protect areas that are not impacted, that we don't want to impact. Next slide, please. And the last method that I will discuss involves distributing the material within the pond by using a conveyor system. There are several options of how this system can be implemented that we're still really evaluating. This slide shows 2 options. The upper visual shows a system in which an access facility or temporary road, like we talked about earlier, is built inside the pond. In this case, a movable conveyor would be used to place the material inside the pond. The conveyor system would move in alignment of the access facility. You can see this on the upper left of the slide, and therefore help distribute the material throughout the pond. And alternative to this option is using a floating conveyor system as shown in the lower visual. This system would utilize a hopper positioned at the shoreline. A hopper is really nothing else than a container that tapers downward to help discharge the material into the conveyor belt. A dozer or similar, it can be an excavator or something else, would load the material into the hopper. The hopper would be fitted with a floating conveyor that would distribute the material throughout the pond. And in all of these cases, like I mentioned earlier, turbidity curtain could be utilized. Thank you, and Anne, back to you.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Luis. Before any of this material can go into the ponds, it must meet quality assurance criteria to ensure no harm to wildlife or the environment. The Fish and Wildlife Service and VTA are working with the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board and the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission to ensure that any excavated material meets stringent criteria for placement in the ponds. Next slide, please. So what happens when the project is complete? Basically, anything that is placed into the wildlife refuge needs to be removed once the project is concluded. Whether it be mobile construction equipment or sheet piles, it must all be removed. Any unpaved access facilities, which are the dirt roads that are built within the ponds to allow access for trucks or a conveyor system, would be broken down, and the material would be used to also help raise the pond bottoms. If the Los Esteros spur option is implemented, the 2 storage tracks south of Los Esteros Road would be removed. If the Pond A12 spur option is implemented, it would also be removed at the end of construction. All areas that were subject to these temporary impacts will be restored to pre-project conditions. Next slide, please. So why do this project? What are the benefits? The initial benefits of transporting the BART excavated material to the salt ponds instead of landfills and quarries is a reduction in greenhouse gases due to the shorter distance from the BART construction site to the ponds. That distance is about 10 miles. Landfills and quarries range from 10 to 42 miles away. Even if we could take all the material to a landfill that was only 10 miles away, you get negligible beneficial reuse by disposing the material in a landfill. On the other hand, placing this material into the salt ponds provides an environmental benefit of what would otherwise be a construction waste product. I need to point out that the restoration of tidal marsh habitat is not part of the beneficial reuse project. However, by placing much needed material into the ponds to help raise the pond bottoms, we are accelerating the timeline to get to a point where this restoration can occur. Once tidal marsh is restored, it would provide such benefits as those listed here: sea level rise resilience, water quality improvements, flood risk management, habitat creation for threatened and endangered species, and greenhouse gas sequestration. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we are just kicking off the environmental process with scoping to get your feedback on the proposed project. Next, we will do the technical analysis, which will take us to the end of this year. Once the draft EIS/EIR is prepared, we will release it for public review and comment in early 2025. The final environmental document will include both responses to all comments received on the draft and any changes to the draft document based on those comments. The final EIS/EIR is anticipated to be complete in the summer of 2025. Next slide, please. As Peter mentioned, you can submit comments today in the chat. However, the best way to submit comments for our written record is by sending an email to the project email address shown here in yellow highlight. You can also send comments by postal mail to the address listed here. Finally, there is a comment form on the VTA project website. No matter which format you choose, your comments are due by February 20th. The reason for this is so that we can collect all the comments and use that information as we begin the technical analysis. With that, I will turn the meeting back over to Peter.
Thank you, Ann. Again, if you do want to leave a comment today, please use the QR code, the project email, or visit the project website, as Ann stated. With about 20 or 30 minutes left in this presentation, we'll probably go for another 5 or 10 if anybody has any other comments. I'm currently seeing we don't have any comments quite yet, but we'll stay on for a little bit longer, see if anybody's going to trickle in with any questions. We do ask you to use the Q&A. We will not be reading individual comments verbatim, but instead grouping similar comments together for discussion. Here are the instructions once again to use the Q&A feature if you'd like to submit your comments here for the panelists or for the presenters. We'll also be posting this recording of this meeting on the project website to be viewed at your convenience. Okay, we do have a question here. Ann or project team, for the programmatic project ponds, I think they're just saying the programmatic ponds. Beyond the ponds that are owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in A4, will there be a need for storing reused sediments before they can be placed in future project ponds?
I think it's about the project level ponds and they called it programmatic. Let me answer if it was project level ponds, and then if it's programmatic, maybe Ann can add to what I'm going to say.
Yeah, Matt's on the line too. He can answer.
Okay, so for the project level ponds, as the material is being excavated from the tunnel, we have, like I mentioned earlier, a storage bin where we can store about 5 to 7 days of production material in that storage bin. But then from that area, we need to be able to keep up with the production of all the material coming out by loading material out of the storage bin into either rail cars or trucks to take the material to the salpons. So that is the only other storage area that we have. It's about 5 to 7 days of work. And the intent would be that from there, we take it to the salpons and place it in there as efficiently and as fast as possible. And we don't believe there's going to be a need for any large storage of material anywhere else.
And then Matt jumped on for the programmatic. So Matt.
Yeah, so if we look broader across the National Wildlife Refuge, which is where those other ponds are, what we're doing through this effort is, and Ann mentioned it at the beginning, is we're just doing some of the initial environmental analysis of what does it mean if we start using sediment to put on the bottom of these former salt production ponds to increase the rate of sediment accretion and ultimately get us to tidal marsh in the future. Where that material would come from, or whether it would need to be stockpiled before it got spread out in the ponds, we will need to come back and do initial analysis based on specific, sources of that material. So similar to some of the restoration work we've done to date, when we've brought in material to build horizontal levees or ecotone or to improve our levees for restoration efforts, we traditionally just bring that material from the source directly to the pond, similarly to what we're doing with the VTA project now. It's conceivable in the future we may set up stockpile locations, but all of that would have to go through further environmental analysis, and we'd come back to the public before we did any of that stockpile. So it's a potential tool in the future. We're doing the initial environmental clearance of just what happens when you start placing sediment on these pond bottoms, but future efforts will require future analysis, and we'll come back to the public for that. Hopefully that answered the question.
Okay. We have another question here. Will all of the excavated soil be able to be used in the ponds, or will there be any left over?
Luis?
Sure. The intent would be to take as much of the material to the project level ponds. Like Ann mentioned, what we're attempting to do is just is a drop in the bucket for all the material that really the salt ponds need to raise the pond bottoms. That said, due to the potential regulatory constraints and the analysis that we still need to perform, that might reduce the volume of material that we can actually take to the salt ponds. And based on those constraints and the analysis that will be performed, some of the material might actually have to go to other locations like quarries, potentially landfills, even though we're going to try to the extent possible to avoid that. We want to make sure that it is being reused in a beneficial way. But those will be the limitations of how much material we can actually take to the salt ponds. Anything else to add to that, Ann?
Well, the only thing I would say, when you look at the environmental document in the future, it will say, and the paperwork so far says up to 3.5 million cubic yards. We'll analyze everything as if all of it's going. That's kind of a worst case scenario, but there are constraints, as Luis mentioned. There are biological constraints. There could be inclement weather that prevents us from going to the salt ponds if everything's just too wet or something. We can't use that. We can't use that destination. So there, it kind of remains to be seen. But in terms of environmental analysis, we are going to assume that everything goes to the salt ponds, all the 3.5 million cubic yards.
Okay. We have another question. Has VTA already done soil samples on the excavated material to make sure there will be no contaminants added to the ponds?
So that's either for Luis or we have another panelist on, Kurt. Kurt, do you want to take it? I see you unmuted.
Yes, I'd be happy to respond. VTA has done a series of sampling along the entire tunnel alignment. And based on the sample results, it shows that the soil is compatible for going into the salt ponds. There's quite a bit more study still going on and ongoing, and we're talking to regulatory agencies for criteria to be implemented during the tunneling project to ensure that the contaminants are within the thresholds that are set for the salt ponds.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. One of the attendees is asking if flood plan issues are being addressed, specifically in Ravenswood Triangle, Menlo Park East, Palo Alto. Is this included in the project scope?
If floodplain, I think that's a Dave question.
Hi, this is Dave Halsey. Yeah, I can answer that. I believe the question is asking about the floodplain issues up in the East Palo Alto Menlo Park area, and there are separate efforts going on both in connection with the San Mateo County Flood Management Agency, with the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and a lot of local governments to look at those. That work is largely unrelated to this project. So it's a question for another time and another place, because it's not really connected with the reuse of tunnel muck material, but entities are looking at it.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. If there are no other questions, we will conclude our meeting tonight. I want to thank everyone who was able to join, and our panelists and our presenters as well. Again, just a reminder, this presentation will be posted on the project website. So thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.